Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Birch and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our videotaping today is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Fund of the U.S. Department of the Interior through the Nebraska State Historical Society and the City of Lincoln, a certified local government. Today our speaker is Ed Zimmer. Ed is a native of Omaha. He has an undergraduate degree in art history and sociology from Lindenwood College in St. Charles, Missouri. He lived in Boston for 11 years and was a freelance architectural historian. While in Boston, he received a PhD at Boston University in architectural history. In 1985, he returned to Nebraska and became and still is the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Planner. Ed's talk today is titled Out of Town Prophets, Lincoln Landmarks by Outsiders. Please join me in welcoming Ed Zimmer.
You might recall that the last few talks I gave on architects in Lincoln and on the Placemakers of Nebraska website project, I think we entitled Forgotten Figures. And I was looking for this subject, and these aren't folks, by and large, that I can call forgotten figures, so I had to come up with a different title. And it seemed there is at least some unifying thread that I could weave through this about leading architects from other places who came and did something significant here. There are a lot more of those than I can cover in 1 hour, but I'm going to take some of the newer work from placemakers and some older work and see if we can weave it together into a coherent theme. It's also, this is the prophets having no honor in their own land. Well, I think we have lots of honorable architects in our own land, but these were all out-of-towners, so they got that extra bump. And we'll start with William Foster, and I have to credit Matt Hansen for bringing Foster, and particularly this building, the State Block, to my attention. This is the building that preceded, and it says right on it, First National Bank, preceded the First National Bank building that we now call the Lincoln Building at 9th and O, southeast corner. This was the predecessor building. It had been sometimes attributed to James Tyler, but I had questioned that because Tyler wasn't in Lincoln yet when this was built, and Matt came up with a solid attribution to Foster. So let's look at what Foster was about. He had some magnificent projects in Lincoln and came upon these at really quite an early stage in his career. He did the penitentiary, which had so many additions to it that I wanted to try to show a part that was all Foster, and I think this corner maybe was all Foster. But that crenellated style, the rough stonework that others followed later. And the penitentiary was begun in 1870, so this is right at the beginning of Lincoln's period as state capital and quite early in Foster's career as well, coming over from Des Moines. Did good enough work that he also got the State Insane Asylum project. If you know the history of that institution, there's another image of a big, not this big, but a big stone building that dates to 1869, which burned down almost immediately. That one was by Winchell, who did other work in Lincoln, but the second asylum building was Foster's work. Huge building, which by 1889 had additions at the end. The pavilions at the end of this are even beyond Foster's work, but stood well into the 20th century. Looking for Foster's work in Lincoln, came upon this ad for J.J. Butler, who I spoke about as one of those forgotten figures. Well, Foster's almost forgettable in this ad. If you squint, in the middle it says officing with Butler is L.H. Foster and Company, Room 6, Commercial Block, Lincoln, Nebraska. Well, we're following William Foster, aren't we? Probably, but in Lincoln he often was referred to as L.W. Foster or L. William Foster, and I don't know why. We'll see, we'll get as close as we can. But when he's first, in 1872, he's advertising, although he's still solidly entrenched in Des Moines. He's advertising in Lincoln papers, but in the office of Butler. I don't think they were ever partners. I think this was just his desk when he's doing projects in Lincoln, which included then the Lancaster Jail. Lancaster County Jail stood on the site of the present County City building, the northwest corner of that block between J and K, 9th and 10th. I always found it rather hard to figure out where this little jail building has stood. So I brought in, for your benefit and mine, that's where it stood, up at the corner of the block. And the courthouse, when it was added almost 20 years after the jail, faced east towards 10th Street. And we'll get back to the courthouse as well. That jail was rather controversial, and there's lots of articles in Lincoln papers, particularly from Artemus Roberts, who was brought in by the county commissioners to look at the bidding and the contract for construction of it. And Roberts thought there were more than one sets of plans that different people were bidding on. Foster none of it seemed to stick to Foster. He wasn't the problem in that case, and his jail got built. And then that state block, which Matt had identified in the Nebraska State Journal, there was a very enthusiastic description of this under construction in 1874-75, saying that when completed and ready for occupancy by the 1st of February 1875, to Mr. William Foster of Des Moines will belong the honor of the design, and from general appearances, there's no better architect in the West than this gentleman. Said about many architects if they had just built something in your town you liked. But here we have this young architect from Des Moines coming and getting a private commission after those public commissions. And he starts advertising in the Lincoln papers directly as L.W. Foster, always officed in Des Moines, but had ads in the Lincoln papers, and cites that they are the architects for Nebraska State Penitentiary, the Insane Asylum, and also the Iowa Penitentiary. That's the one at Anamosa. He has then a very successful career in Des Moines. The accounts of his career reference that he was the first Des Moines architect to be getting the kind of projects that previously had only gone to outsiders, which also kind of put today's title in my mind. In Lincoln, he was still one of those outsiders in the new town getting his work. The closest I can come to where this LW comes from and who the and Company was, I think it's possible, and I haven't been able to prove this. His first wife was Laura W. Foster. He's a young guy. He's trying to establish himself and maybe look a little more substantial than he was. And maybe that's my wife and I, architects. She wasn't an architect by anything I can determine, but the only LW I can find in the family is his first wife. I think it was Louise W. He then remarries in the mid-1880s to a Laura, which makes it confusing as well. And there's complications in the records whether she had died and he remarries. I think they divorced, because I find in the Lincoln papers accounts of Mrs. William Foster from New York City coming back and visiting after his second marriage. So I think she had friends back in town, and there still are a few things to clean up about his account, but I've got all of his Lincoln buildings as far as I know, and I think maybe we're done with the Nebraska cleanup on his career. He goes on in Des Moines after quite a few years of successful architecture and building some opera houses to owning those opera houses. And at one point has a monopoly on the major opera houses in Des Moines, and really in the 1890s and early 20th century is a theater man, no longer an architect. He announces in July of 1909 that business was about run out. He was going to finish a contract he had with touring companies by 1911. And he thought at that time he would probably tear down one of his major theaters and build an office building there. maybe on the manner of a skyscraper, he said. Instead, by the end of the year, in his sleep, a leaky gas pipe or a leaky gas vent on a heater in bathroom beside his bedroom filled his room with gas, and he and a young visitor to their home both died in December of 1909. And I touch on Elijah E. Myers because I'll get to read you a wonderful quote from an architectural historian about his career. He was going to be the designer of the Lancaster County Courthouse and drew up a plan that was accepted by the county board. They did estimates on building it, struggled with it for 2 years, 1887 to 1888, and finally had to reject this neoclassical design. Meyer did courthouses around the country. He did, or was hired to do state capitals in Texas, Colorado. I'll come up to one other. He was fired from most of those places. And I thought he probably deserved having his portrait up when I read this description from the very good architectural historian Paul Goldner, who said that several important buildings of Meyer's design have survived to prove his ability as an architect. They include the state capitals in Michigan, Texas, and Colorado, courthouses in Macon, Carlinville, and Galesburg, Illinois, Richmond City Hall, and I'll get back to it. Central Methodist Episcopal Church in Lansing. Their architect was talented, dishonest, hardworking, spiteful, clever, unbalanced, self-assured, self-destructive hypochondriac, whose story must be pieced together from fragments. He will always be somewhat mysterious, evasive, and much more interesting than many of his more conventional contemporaries. It was worth it, wasn't it? I can't write that way, but I can quote. And trying to find out his life path, these various projects, he lied a lot, makes it harder on historians. But he intersected with Lincoln on a building that was not built. What was built was by Frank Ellis, who I can also call an out-of-towner, because he was from Illinois, but principally practiced from Omaha for the buildings that matter to us in Lincoln. I included the Richards Block on the corner of 11th and O. This would be where Dish Restaurant is today, in the successor to this building. I built this in 1883 to 85, and it burned down right at the end of the 19th century. He designed the first congregational church, which we'll weave back into the story because we're pointing towards First Plymouth in all of this talk. This sat at the northwest corner of 13th and L, and he designed it in 1883. It's built by 1886. On the corner of the Cornhusker, where the Miller Time Bar and Grill would be. That's where the Congregational Church sat. This was Ellis's site plan for the courthouse that replaced the Meyer design. Up in the corner is where the jail already stood. The Historical Society has a wonderful set of drawings for Ellis's Lancaster County Courthouse, and it was built faithfully to those designs. Eventually, the tower was lost, and it was a much reduced building in appearance before it was torn down in the 1960s and replaced with the County City building that's now the Law Center, and then replaced on its site eventually with the current County City building. And to further orient you between the courthouse and the jail, this is one of the few postcards that shows them both. This would be the view from the 10th and K corner looking southwest. Now, to get to First Plymouth Church, I'm going to have to make a leap of about 3 or 4 decades and into the 1920s. And to make the transition, I'm going to borrow this 1927 newspaper showing some of the gardens of Lincoln. It also seemed like a day, it doesn't hurt to remember that summer will come. photos here aren't too good, but two of them show elements of Dr. Roscoe Smith's garden. And the note up on the top of this one says, "Bananas are ripening in Dr. Smith's garden." And we see a fountain and a banana tree. And there's also an image of this arcade looking through to that fountain and banana tree. What this was about, in Dr. Smith, Roscoe Smith's house, is shown us by this building permit of 1922 for Roscoe L. Smith to be built by Peter Hansen. And the architect is listed as Albert Kelsey. When I first read that, I thought, now, what strange unknown figure did they find to design this house? The house still stands, quite spectacular. This is the house that's kind of tucked back on Royal Court, South 28th, and Eastgate, a little loop just below Van Dorn on the east side of 27th Street. To orient you a little bit to that, we have the Sanborn showing the houses surrounding that great big house. And what that big site, if you imagine everything from the house and all of them facing it, if we look at an old Sanborn, the one beside it, he had that whole tract. So the house would have sat alone on that and faced 27th below Van Dorn. House still stands and still has that wonderful courtyard. And Kelsey is not some unknown. You just took a little reminding, because I actually had written about him about 40 years ago. Mr. Kelsey was a Philadelphia architect and a distinguished looking fellow who designed some fabulous buildings all around the country. This is the Baptist Church of 1921, just about the same time as the Smith House in Lincoln. This is in Austin, Texas. Best known among his buildings is the Pan American Building in Washington, D.C., which Kelsey did with Paul Philippe Cray. And that's going to bring us back to Lincoln again as well. Pan American was built in, I think it was right around 1910, has within it a courtyard and glass roof as well. And I couldn't resist, this was just such a beautiful postcard, or such a beautiful early color picture. Had to bring in that courtyard. His partner Cray, to wrap us back to Lincoln, the only Kelsey connection we know of is that Smith House. But his partner Cray, French-born, another Philadelphia architect, was among the 10 competitors for the Nebraska State Capitol design. And this is going to directly get us to McGonigal and First Plymouth, which is where I'm heading with all this. Cray's was the second, I think they labeled it number 2, second from the top on the right-hand side, the neoclassical without a dome. And that was Cray's offering among the 10 designs for the state capitol. Obviously, the most prominent Lincoln landmark by an out-of-town architect, and that most prominent architect would be Goodhue. I think you access many experts on the Capitol in these sessions, and I won't try to be competing with them, but I do have to mention the Goodhue connection that weaves through these out-of-town figures as well. So I'll use that July 4th, 1920 newspaper that published all of the failing designs, and on the front page of the second section had this big spread of the successful design by Goodhue for the Capitol. And the handsome Mr. Goodhue, who unfortunately only survived then 4 years after the selection of the Capitol, 2 years after construction started, and the project had to be finished the last 8 years by his office, his associates. But that gets us to Mr. McGonigal, because he was another of those 10 competitors, another Philadelphia, or another New York City architect, and the architect of First Plymouth Church. This is one of the figures, as we think about the placemakers of Nebraska, how do we approach someone who's nationally known, but who did only one building here, but a fabulous building here that isn't well covered really within his other scholarship on him. So it seemed to me what we would try to do would be to put our building in the context of his career, not try to cover his whole career, that's well done, but to have enough of his career that we could understand this important building here and know where that building fit in his broader career. Now, this is not a toga party. This is our connection of McGonigal to, unfortunately, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. These are the Booth brothers. John Wilkes Booth on the left, Edwin Booth in the center, and Junius Booth Jr. on the right, together doing Shakespeare's Julius Caesar in 1864. They're doing a fundraiser to put a statue of Shakespeare in Central Park. But the brothers were together. The only time they apparently performed together was this occasion in 64. Their political views were widely divergent. Edwin was a Union supporter. John Wilkes obviously was not. I don't know where the other brother fell politically. This is Edwin Booth in a John Singer Sargent portrait towards the end of his life. And the Booth connection is that Edwin was married first to Mary Devlin in 1860. She only survived 3 years. They had a child together. He married again, but his brother-in-law, who had married Mary Devlin's sister Catherine, was Mr. McGonigal's father. And it's not a slight connection in that our architect McGonigal's father was the business manager for Edwin Booth, probably the most famous Shakespearean actor of the second half of the 20th century in America, founder of the Players Club in New York City, which Mr. McGonigal's father managed for his brother-in-law. McGonigal's father was at Booth's bedside when he died of a stroke in 1893 and was one of his executors. So these two brothers-in-law were intimately connected through the rest of their lives together. And the son of the business manager, the brother-in-law, Harold Van Buren McGonigal, who apparently thought that was too much name, so he always seemed to go by H. Van Buren McGonigal, begins his career in architecture as an apprentice at about age 13 to New York City architects, serves about a dozen years as draftsman in various offices, goes off towards the end of that period to Boston to the Boston partnership with the architect Roach, because he wants to compete for the Roach Scholarship, which was a 2-year gig that you were required, which was the whole point for the young architects, to travel in Europe for 2 years studying architecture. H. Van Buren goes off to Boston, studies for 2 years, takes the exam. The exam has a wonderful description, if I can manage my notes. It's a 3-day event. The first morning was theory and practice. The afternoon, they were tested on elementary French. On Saturday morning, there was an examination in original design, and McGonigal won the competition. And so from 1894 to 1896, he travels for 2 years in Europe, coming up out of what appears to be really a pretty humble background in New York City. Our actors weren't rich, actors' managers were especially not rich, and he had been apprenticing since he was 13, but he goes off for this fabulous 2 years to study on the Grand Tour, studies throughout Europe, ends up at the American Academy in Rome. He's a wonderful draftsman. It really launches him on the rest of his career. And that career focuses in large part on monuments and memorials. His first big breakthrough, he serves in the Spanish-American War, has a partnership in New York City in the last years of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And then in 1900 is awarded the memorial to the battleship Maine for Central Park. And this really was the national monument. I don't know if it helped that he was a young veteran of that war, but this very young architect getting a plum commission, obviously working directly with a sculptor, for this major monument. It takes 13 years from the time he's awarded the commission until it's completed in 1913, but it really launches him among New York City and national architects. Quite a spectacular piece. 1904, he gets the McKinley Memorial in Canton, Ohio. This one goes up relatively rapidly. It's finished by 1907. But this mausoleum to McKinley and his wife, and really the national memorial to the assassinated president. Now, this is not a McGonigal, but he is directly involved. And this, I think, as I tracked him through his career, I wasn't trying to list every one of his works as I would with a Nebraska architect, but I was trying to pick up threads that would reflect on First Plymouth. And this is the Baha'i Temple outside Chicago. It's 1920 by architect Bourgeois. McGonigal did not compete in this competition, but by this point in his career, 1920, he's either competing in most major competitions or he's on the jury for these competitions. In this instance, the builders, the Baha'i governance body that want to build this temple, get down to two designs, one a quite conventional one and one this very unconventional one. They say they want an advisor to come in and help them finally pick. Bourgeois says, I don't want one of those national Beaux-Arts guys. They'll all go the other way. But they insist, yes, they will bring in the advisor they want, and they bring in McGonigal, who is as Beaux-Arts as can be. He's had the grand tour, but he comes in, looks at the two designs, and advises the Baha'i church fathers that if they want a striking and original design, which embodies all styles without unduly favoring any, by uniting them into an original unity well symbolizing the spirit of the religious movement for which the temple must stand, they have no choice but to take Bourgeois' design. So he comes in as a Beaux-Arts architect opposed by Bourgeois and says, that's the one. If I understand what you want and what you need to represent your faith, which combines all other faiths, and there's a doorway for each of the major religions they identify, this is the building you need. So he's a talented critic and I think also an acute evaluator of architectural designs and not really just locked into one manner or one style, especially in his advice to this project. So at the same time as he's looking at the Baha'i temple design, he's offering his design for the Nebraska competition. And McGonigal's competition design looks like most of the others. It looks like the National Capitol in Washington. One thing that makes it stand out to a degree and that will remind us of something we will see at First Plymouth is he's got these great columns flanking the main entrance and a statue on top of each column. Now, I thought maybe I would open today saying this will be the talk about Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Adirondack cabins, and Shakespearean actors. But there is a direct connection between these Adirondack cabins. This is also 1920. McGonigal gets involved with a camp development in upstate New York called Okara, and designs for them a series of model cabins that they might build on the site. This is one of McGonigal's watercolors depicting what cabins might look like. He's quoted in a 1920 article about these designs saying that he wanted to make sure that the cabins that would be built wouldn't look urban, they would look like they fit in their setting, and he particularly wanted to make sure that the colors were right. He's quoted as saying, the principal motive actuating the design of this series of lodges was first to find something in design and color suited to the Adirondack background. It took me 3 months of scrambling around through the brush last summer to find the true Adirondack color. There you have it in a hazy blue. The complement is the gray-black of spruce bark after a rain, and the fall colors, the gold of the beeches and the scarlet of the maples after the first hard frost, would be the accent colors on these cabins. Now here it's not the specific colors, but the notion that he is trying to discover the true color that goes with his design. And here on very humble, tiny buildings, but the same concept is going to carry over directly to First Plymouth. I found an illustration of at least one of these cabins that still stands. Usually when these are described, and they obviously have a Japanese influence, there's mention that that is because he designed the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, but that was after the cabins. So his interest was clear and strong before he designs the embassy. His last big project, well, the embassy comes before First Plymouth as well, but the huge project in the middle of the 20s is Liberty Memorial in Kansas City, which in this postcard looks so overblown. You know, it could not have looked like this, could it? Well, maybe not with the flame at the top, but it does look like that. Spectacular, huge project with the flanking buildings and the column at the center. And at the top of that column, figures directly incorporated into the sculpture of the sculptural figures incorporated into the column. McGonigal was obviously an architect. He also was a painter and a sculptor. His wife was also a painter, and he hired her to be the sculptor on the major frieze work on this building. And at that, the commission running the project shook their head and said, no, she hasn't done major sculptures. She was a painter principally, and he was not allowed to hire his wife for the sculptress on the project. They fly off together to Tokyo, and he does the embassy there, stopping off in Hawaii on the way. And then we get to where we're going to dial into the project that brings him to a Lincoln landmark. He was visiting Lincoln in December of 1927, before the First Plymouth project really had been announced. And what an article at that time in the paper said is that the famous architect, McGonigal, took the opportunity to go through the Capitol from the basement to the top of the tower twice. And to make a study of the new Capitol, his conclusion that it is the most significant piece of architecture yet produced in the United States. And he adds in that analysis that Mr. Goodhue was a Gothicist, but instead of trying to crowd the requirements of the Nebraska Capitol into a Gothic envelope, he went over to the classical. In fact, he used any form that would serve the purpose of the state. And I think much like his analysis of the design for the Baha'i Temple, he realizes and recognizes in the Nebraska Capitol that this building has been invented and designed for the specific program. And not only the functional program of the state, but the budget and the symbolic and what we could almost even call the spiritual program of this building that would symbolize Nebraska government and be the dominant design element through the landscape. I think he's in town to be talking to the church, but what he's talking to the press about is his view of the Capitol. In February of 28, there starts to be discussion in the press of the First Plymouth project. First Congregational downtown was selling their building site, as was First Presbyterian, for the eventual construction of the Cornhusker Hotel. They were reuniting with their spin-off parish, Plymouth Congregational, to form First Plymouth and pick this beautiful site on the high ground of 20th and D. And they go about bringing in 3 architectural designs, a Gothic design, a colonial design, and one in the new independent form of architecture, which tells us which way they were leaning from the start, particularly, I think, the pastor, Benjamin Weiland. The pastor sets up a fact-finding committee of church members, basically asks them to go look at churches they like, and then ask them for their designs and send them back, and we'll all look at them together. And so they do, kind of reminds me of the high school construction project of LPS. You have a community conversation about what you're going to need. You start working together and you figure out what direction to go. Mr. Collins of Boston, of Collins and Allen, a large Boston firm, presented the colonial design. Goodhue Associates were brought in for the Gothic design, and Mr. Hardy Phillips of the Goodhue Associates presents a design. And then McGonigal of New York presented original designs for a new type of church architecture. That's how the church was describing it. And this is the preliminary design, not exactly what was built. You'll notice particularly the D Street frontage is 2 stories, not just the screen wall for the arcade, but substantially the design built is the one chosen by the church. There's a description in the church records that many informal meetings were held over a period of several months, viewing the designs of Mr. McGonigal, and the sympathy and goodwill exhibited towards them moved the committee. And at their last meeting, they instructed the pastor to inform the church as to the situation. That was done. That means they picked McGonigal. Beautiful rendering for the tower. In association with McGonigal on this project was Robert W. McLaughlin, Jr., who was a generation younger, academically trained architect with a master's degree, in fact, from Princeton. He had joined, even with his master's, had joined McGonigal first as a draftsman for a year, and then they are described as in association. I think it wasn't a typical partnership, but rather for projects. It's a period of about 3 years. This seems to be the major project they did. McLaughlin was often in Lincoln for the project and was quoted in Lincoln Press about the project. As completed by 31-32, and I think the second best tower in Lincoln, a particularly beautiful church design, and a design that could be expanded as the church had further needs. The chapel was added, the educational wing, the music and office wing, but still retaining the essential character. And each of those additions over the 20th and early 21st century were, I think, more and more respectful and comfortable in being respectful of the beauty of the original design, down to the pattern of the brickwork. And let's talk about the brickwork a little bit, because I think it's one of the particularly spectacular things of this church. In the early descriptions, as early as 1930, when it's still under construction, McLaughlin's in town and describes to the reporter that they had chosen 3 fundamental colors: old rose, mulberry, and old gold. The 2 basic colors, the gold and the old rose, being the true colors of Nebraska. We're not building a little cabin here in the Adirondacks, but we're still trying to discover the true local colors. And the rose for the sunsets, the gold for the harvest fields, and I assume the mulberry for the mulberries. I'm a fan of mulberries. And then to add to the beauty, 5 different sizes of bricks have been used, forming a pattern in the masonry work that, when viewed as a painting might be from a distance, blends together into a coherent whole. And they specifically cite in that 1930 article, quoting McLaughlin, that he had studied the town hall in Stockholm, and that was a specific source of inspiration for the brickwork. You'll see the connection immediately, I'm sure. This is the town hall in Stockholm. It was built 1911 to 1923, and the architect was Ragnar Ostberg. I haven't been able to find, sometimes in Ancestry.com we can find passport applications, and I have those for McGonigal. I can't find ones for McLaughlin, but I found other indications. He was traveling soon after graduating from his master's program and before he's working on First Plymouth. So I think he must have gotten to Stockholm, because in black and white photos, you wouldn't have gotten what he clearly got out of this building. It has this wonderful arcade, across the base of the building. In fact, that whole wing of the building stands up as if on stilts, so from the interior plaza there, you have a view to the water. But to really get the brickwork, the best image I could find, I had to go to one of the interior views, and there's a beautiful range of color in the brickwork of this building. But you'll notice there is not a variety in the sizes of the bricks, just in the color. One reason I think he must have seen it in person was, would you have gotten that from a black and white photo? I don't, maybe from a description and a color painting or something, but this had to do very specifically with the color. I'm still puzzling with how do they know how to lay up a new wall of this? And Dave Murphy was able to explain to me and point out where the bonding courses are, and they occur every 7th course, more or less, because sometimes it seems to be the 4th course. I think there are 11 sizes, shapes, and colors of brick, as best I can tell here. 3, and I'm not counting headers and stretchers as different sizes, which is just the position of the brick. But there are, I think, 5 major colors, and then 4 different sizes, and it's just quite spectacular. And when they put on new additions, the architects and masons together can make this work. I think there must be some broad principles, like every 7th course is a bonding course where you turn a brick and you see the header, and then some general laws, like you don't put the big size blocks close together, and you don't put the old gold blocks close together, bricks close together, and somehow they make it work. But quite spectacular. The true colors of Nebraska. Now, to wrap up, just a couple more of the leading figures, and they all seem to weave together. As Congregational Church is building its new building because they had been displaced from their downtown site, so were the Presbyterians. And First Presbyterian hire Cram and Ferguson, Ralph Adams Cram, and his partner Frank Ferguson, to do First Presbyterian over in 17th and F. I don't get the impression from his writings or his photos that Cram was a fun guy. Very serious, very intense, the leading Gothicist, neo-Gothicist in America. Cover of Time magazine, right about the time he was doing the design for Lincoln of First Presbyterian. They associate with Davis and Wilson as their local connection in building First Pres, and accomplished this beautiful, pristine Gothic church. There were designs for a major tower. Cram loved major towers. It probably would have cost what the whole church cost and was not constructed. It has a much more restrained but beautiful brickwork, and here the bond is what's called English bond, where alternating courses are all headers, and then all stretchers, all headers, all stretchers. Flemish bond is when within each row your alternating headers and stretchers makes a different pattern in the wall. Cram and Ferguson had been partners the decade before, and had designed major churches like St. Thomas, Fifth Avenue in New York City, 1911, 1914. Goodhue designed the high altar, and Lee Lowry, sculptor of our capital, did the carving for this major spectacular wall. This is the tower that Cram would have put on St. John the Divine, his probably most prominent church in New York City, of 1911, if he had been allowed. It didn't get built, but he had a thing for towers. And then a few other architects you've heard of, just to wrap up and to get closer to the present date. Obviously, Philip Johnson's Sheldon, gorgeous building by one of our out-of-town prophets. But you also have to go on to the Placemaker's site now and then just to see Murphy's gorgeous photographs. I think this is a wonderful view of that major Lincoln landmark, now on the National Register of Historic Places. An even younger landmark, I.M. Pei's NBC Center, now Wells Fargo Center, 1972. And Murphy can make it sing too in his photo. And we'll finish with Robert M. Stern and the Quilt Center, the International Quilt Study Center at 33rd and Holdridge, which Allie Pointer Macchiato were the Nebraska local connection construction of this building in 2008. Beautiful interior. But I also think there's some connection. You usually can't build an absolutely windowless blank wall along a major street like Holdridge and not have turned your back on that street. But in the beautiful forms of this, and especially the brickwork pattern of that wall, where we're making pretty specific quilt references in the brickwork, we're again using all of the elements to tell the story and create a beautiful landmark, and again by an out-of-town prophet. That's what I had to bring you today. If you have any questions, I'll make up answers.
I have two questions.
Wayne, two questions from Wayne.
Fargo building.
I'll hold one in this hand and one in this hand.
Okay. How do you pronounce the architect's last name? And was he personally involved in the design of that building?
Wayne's asking about the Wells Fargo, or let's call it the NBC Center, because that's what it was called when it was built, and whether I think I often say pay and some people say pie, and I don't think after we get past the IMP, people worry too much. So he's the same man. I believe one of his associates was the lead on the project, and not the principal of another principal in the firm, but I think it was not the old man himself, who's still. Generally on this site, we don't have living architects with a full page, but it does occur. Matt?
Can you go back to the watercolor of First Plymouth, the McGonagall watercolor?
I bet I can if I do it right. Everybody close your eyes for a second. Matt's question was whether, based on this watercolor, there was consideration of doing the building in limestone rather than in brick, and whether that changed in the course of it. I saw nothing to suggest that there was a change in material. The quote I'm using is 1930, when the building was well underway, but I think it's so integral to the way McGonagall had been approaching buildings for some time, and obviously McLaughlin is on board with it, that it doesn't make sense to me that they were considering anything other than the brick.
So maybe this rendering was more to show form and not so much about the appearance of the pillar.
Yeah, what was this rendering maybe about form? And I think that could be very well the case, that this is, and certainly the black and white studies are about the form, not the material. I don't know if we have anything that directly shows their brick scheme in their drawings. We don't have extensive drawings in the city collection, and I haven't seen them in the.
Are the joints visible in that rendering? I mean, can you see like larger blocks, or are they brick-sized units? Or?
The question is whether this is a published watercolor, and I don't know that it shows jointing, but that's a good question, and I have to study it. I have a reproduction of a reproduction of a published of a watercolor, but I'll go study it as soon as I get back to the office. Eileen?
The quilt house brickwork that you talked about, the screen wall, I think that's interesting how it shows where the verticals, the four vertical bricks were taken out, and that's the screen.
It-
And you can see that in the picture that you had.
Eileen was commenting on the quilt house screen wall and the way that there's both solid wall in the pattern, and then you subtract some of the brick in that. Those would be the sailor course. When the brick's standing up that way, it's a sailor. Subtract those and you have a screen wall with piercings. I don't think there's any, well, that's the soldier course, the sailors that way. I don't think there's any sailor bricks in this pattern. Hardly ever do they get laid that way. Well, thank you all.